Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction, and it is a great pleasure to be here to kick off the conference for the AECR. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to the United Kingdom, to all our friends from around Europe. I hope that the next few sessions are going to be both useful in terms of building friendships and contact, but also sharing conservative values between politicians who share a huge amount in common ideologically, with common purpose, common interests, and common ideas. And indeed, one of the things I am most proud of in the past decade has been the way in which my party, the Conservatives, have come together with very many of your parties to create the group in the European Parliament, to start to challenge the status quo, to start to challenge those who say reform was not necessary, to start to say there needs to be a different kind of European Union. And you in this room tonight embody that new movement, that new set of ideas, and it's quite clear to me from the way the group has grown in the European Parliament and the way in which we have built friendships and partnerships with non-EU nations and our like-minded parties there, that we have created a movement with purpose and which has been long overdue. So I very much hope that you all have a very successful conference and really benefit from the sharing of ideas that's going to happen. Now, of course, you're arriving in the United Kingdom at a moment of celebration for Conservatives. I would be lying if I said to you that on election night, when the exit poll was published that showed us very comfortably ahead of the Labour Party, that every one of us said, yeah, we knew that was going to happen. I would also be lying to you if I said there were very many people around who actually believed we'd win a majority. I never doubted we'd be the largest party, but the degree to which we were successful was a pleasure and a surprise to many. But also, actually, it's been one of those campaigns where when you look back at all the conversations on the doorsteps, and I visited more than 60 constituencies around the country, that actually you could see the signs there. You didn't actually find very many people who said they were going to vote Labour. You found a lot of people who said they were going to vote Conservative, a lot more who said they hadn't made their minds up, and no real enthusiasm for the other side. And so those of us who perhaps thought, well, you know, David Cameron is self-evidently the best candidate for Prime Minister, and our economy is doing really well, and indeed a Labour MP who I met at an event during the campaign came up to me and said, I cannot believe, given how far ahead you are on the economy, that you're not far ahead in the polls. Actually, underneath the surface, that's precisely where we were. The people were saying, actually, don't want to change, want to stick with what we've got. And you look back at the things that made a real difference. And I hope that there are some lessons from our campaign that will be beneficial to all of our friends and partners. A very clear message. What we did over the past 6 months was stick very clearly to the message about the economy, to what became the slogan that got all the journalists tearing their hair out. We kept talking about a long-term economic plan, but that is actually what it was and what it is and what it will continue to be. And we kept talking about our plan. And we all know those old adages about you need to tell people once, tell them twice, tell them 3 times, eventually it may sink in. And I do think that consistency of message made a huge difference. And of course, it was much easier for us that in 2010 we had a very clear track record to demonstrate, albeit slightly encumbered by Liberal Democrats, and they had an interesting night, didn't they? But we went into the campaign with a strong track record and a clear message. And despite all of the ups and downs of the campaign and the polls, actually at the end, that is what won through. And I think it's a real lesson to all of us about how to fight successful election campaigns. Now, of course, there were some local issues that emerged in the United Kingdom during the campaign. The Scottish issue. I have to say the idea of a minor party that was in danger of getting the balance of power, talking in a fairly swaggering way about what it would use that balance of power for, proved to be quite helpful in getting people unprompted on the doorstep to say, we don't really want that. We were helped by the fact that we had a Labour leader who people looked at, they looked at him again, and they finally decided he really wasn't for them. And if I have one handy hint for you from this election campaign, and this probably is something that every one of you could put into practice in your future election planning, don't carve your manifesto pledges on a giant piece of rock and take it around the country saying you're going to erect it in government, particularly when your name is Ed. Because, as you will know, the Ed Stone, as it is now known, a shortened version of what would be the normal English phrase for a stone in a graveyard, the Ed Stone wasn't the most successful item on the political agenda in the campaign. And indeed there is now, our newspapers have been running a campaign to try and find the Ed Stone. They have now located it in a warehouse in southeast London, and it transpires that the man who created it in the first place voted Conservative, thought it was ridiculous, and thought the pledges would never be kept. So, handy hint, do not carve your election pledges onto a great big piece of rock. The other lesson from our campaign, you know that we faced, and many of you face, a rise of populism. Fringe parties that have attracted considerable support and risk undermining our work as the sensible reformers. And they have taken from us some of our supporters, and they have posed a genuine challenge to us in many of our constituencies. But actually, when it came to the campaign itself, that clear message, the fallibility of the alternative government, the worry about Scotland, meant, I think, that a very substantial proportion of those who were tempted to vote in the UK for the UK Independence Party came back to the Conservatives. And actually, in the end, those people on the left, those natural Labour supporters who were attracted by the populist message, stayed with them and actually ended up doing more damage to Labour members of Parliament, former members of Parliament in their constituencies, and caused a number of them to lose than we would ever have expected, ever thought possible. So it is clear to me that the way in which we combat the rise of those parties who represent a threat to us is to stick to our principles, be clear in our message, but also offer a clear governmental alternative, and to make it clear to people who might be tempted to vote for them that if you do, you will only be letting in the people who you really do not want in government from the left. And I think the last lesson from our general election is that I don't think any of our minor parties are going to be going to coalition anytime soon in the future. None of us really expected what happened to the Liberal Democrats to happen on the night. I would never have believed for a second they could end up with 8 members of Parliament. Now, many of you from other parts of Europe will have experienced the situation where minor parties have been the sufferers in a coalition. It's a big lesson for us in this country about the way politics works. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see in future, if we end up with hung parliaments in future, how on earth they resolve themselves, because I think there will be a very real reluctance, given the Lib Dem experience, to stay in government as part of a coalition. So that's the experience. The election we won, and thank goodness we did, because those of you who've been watching the British political scene since, the chaos that has ensued, 3 party leaders resigning, 1 then unresigning, and I suspect those of you in the European Parliament had an interesting and amusing day yesterday in the debates. But actually it really brings home how important it was for the UK that we won that election and that we can press ahead with clear policies for the future. So what's our agenda for the next 5 years? Well, that economic plan has to continue. We still face big challenges. We still have a budget deficit in the region of 5% of GDP. That will have to come down. The Chancellor this week set out plans for further public spending reductions. We'll continue many of our reforms in welfare, for example, where there are both social benefits as well as financial benefits to be had from continuing the work that we did in the last Parliament. And you mentioned constitutional reform. We are going to go through a period of very substantial constitutional reform. To deal with the issue in Scotland, we believe passionately that it is important to keep our United Kingdom together, but also to recognise the desire in Scotland, and indeed other parts of the UK, for devolution of powers from Westminster. And you will see that happen in Scotland, you will see it happen in Wales, you will see it happen in the English regions. But I have responsibility for one of the counterbalances to that. It is simply not realistic to go further into the future with a situation where Scottish members of Parliament can come to Westminster and vote on education in my constituency, just outside London, but in return, I cannot vote on education matters in theirs. It has been a flaw in our devolution system for a long time. It is one that we will now resolve. I have responsibility for delivering the solutions to that, started in the last Parliament by my predecessor, William Hague. You will see over the coming weeks and months a significant change to the way our Parliament operates in a way that ensures that England has a fair deal as well in the constitutional changes that lie ahead. Now, you will not be surprised to hear me say that actually this Parliament is also, certainly in its early stages, going to be heavily dominated by matters related to the European Union. And I know there are very many people in this room who share my view of the need for change in the European Union. I think the status quo is not an option. And what's been interesting this week, we've had a number of prominent international businesses talking about the need for Britain to remain in the European Union, but not actually to remain in a status quo European Union, but in a reformed European Union. There is an almost unanimous view in this country that if we are to remain in the European Union, it has to be different. It has to move away from the relentless drive towards federalism. Actually, I have a confession to make this evening. You may be surprised to learn that there is a very eminent lady who you all know well who is now missing from my life. She was once described to me by one of our journalists as the gift that keeps on giving. You all know her as a fellow member of the European Parliament, but I knew her as Vice President of the European Commission, Viviane Reding. A lady who has very pronounced views about what Europe needs to be. I used to follow her on Twitter. She used to come up with some extraordinary tweets. I long for the day when we have an elected European government. I long for the day when we have an elected European president. I remember we were going to have a European system of birth registration so that you didn't have to do that in your own country. Now, she is no longer in the Commission. She is now in the Parliament, and as far as I understand it, not a massive presence in your Parliament in terms of position held. And she and I, in the conversations we have, used to agree to disagree. But my point is more serious. She represents a view of the European Union that is still very present in the institutions in Brussels. People from her directorate now hold very senior positions in the Commission. They would take the European Union in a direction that I believe is wrong for the United Kingdom. I actually happen to believe is wrong for Europe as well. And I think that a combination of the issues in the Eurozone, the desire of that group of people in Brussels to take the EU down a further track towards federalisation, towards integration, towards the creation of that European government, is why it is so important that we grasp this bull by the horns now and that we seek to change our relationship as a nation with the European Union. But that we also actually, I hope, in doing so, encourage others to accept that this is the moment for reform as well. I think, personally, that the biggest issue facing the United Kingdom, and I think facing many of us right now, is that given all that has happened in the Eurozone, and I've made no bones about my belief, and my colleagues have over the years, that we do not believe that the creation of the euro was the right step to take, those 10, 15 years ago. But it's there, it is a fact, and if the Eurozone is to survive, it will have to become more integrated, it will have to become more closely aligned in a whole range of policy areas. And of course, the Eurozone together has control over, in majority terms, over the Council, over the Parliament, and inevitably, because every country will want to look after its interests, the Eurozone collectively will want to look after its interests. Those of us who are not part of the Eurozone and are not going to be part of the Eurozone risk finding ourselves on the outside, risk finding it difficult to protect our national interest. And in a whole variety of different ways, it is time for us to address that issue. It is why David Cameron's strategy of renegotiation is absolutely right. Now, I always joke, I count myself as being on the Eurosceptic wing of the Eurosceptic wing of my party. But I am somebody who is foursquare behind David Cameron's strategy because I don't believe the status quo is an option. I don't want us to be debating in a referendum the status quo or leaving. I want the people of this country to have a new approach, a new deal on the table, and that is why our Prime Minister's strategy is so important. And what's been quite interesting is to see how, in response to our election victory, in response to the new direction that we are now setting, that others have started, most recently in Germany, to talk about the need for reform as well. Now, I do want to make one thing clear in talking about these issues. We are not, as a nation, we are not as a party, little Englanders. We're not inward-facing. We don't believe in a world that ends at our borders. We are an optimistic, outward-facing internationalist country that has always been a player in the world, has always sought to work with other nations, has always sought to help try and make the world a better place. That must never stop. We've always been international in our business, in our economic focus. We've always been, in the UK, a centre for international business, a centre for international trade. I don't want that to stop either. We have strong links around the world, in the Commonwealth countries, in Asia, in North America, as well as in Europe. All of that should be a part of our future. And the last thing on earth that we would wish to do is find ourselves in a position where we walked away from our friends in Europe. That is absolutely not what we're about. What we have to secure is a different environment within Europe for us to have those friendships and those partnerships. We want to be able to protect our national interest. We want to be able to respond to the very real concerns of our people. But we also want to be a country that is collaborative, friendly, a good nation to do business with. And I think over the next 2 years, however long it takes, we have a real opportunity to deliver change. And I think working together, we have an opportunity to deliver change. Because we are all in this room, like-minded people, who believe that change must come, that believes that the European Union has to be reformed, that shares the view of all those international businessmen who have been on our radio stations this week, saying it's really vital that Britain is a part of the European Union. But they say so, as I say, a reformed European Union. And that is what our Prime Minister is seeking to achieve. A reform to our relationship with the European Union, but also, I believe, to facilitate the kind of change that we believe is necessary if we are all to flourish economically. Deregulation, to become more outwardly focused, to become less bureaucratic, to become less concentrating our own affairs and become more of an outwardly facing continent, looking to take advantage of the real changes that are happening around the world. That's what I believe we are all about ideologically. It's the purpose that we all share. It's what we will seek to achieve in the discussions over the next 2 or 3 days and then working together in the European Parliament and elsewhere. And I passionately believe that we can deliver the changes that are necessary. I believe we can make sure our nations and our country are better places. I believe that working together we can bring strength to each other's political parties. And that's why I think a network like this one is so important to all of us. I think all of us would say that the status quo is not an option. For those of us in power, there are jobs still to do, changes still to deliver. For those of us who are not in power, there are elections to win. For all of us as members of the European Union, there are changes to deliver. We have a big period of change ahead of us. We have to offer the people of our country the choice about staying or going. But what we must do as friends and colleagues is to make sure that we work together to secure the best possible future for all of our citizens. So thank you very much for coming to the United Kingdom. Thank you very much for being part of such an exciting partnership. Thank you to Dan for the work he does in coordinating all of this. This, I hope, is going to be a very exciting and interesting few days. A glass or two of wine while you're here, a historic venue, a lovely setting, but above all, a venue for friendship between nations. And that is something that whatever we do, whatever happens in our renegotiation, whatever happens in our referendum, whatever our future as a nation, what we have in the collegiality in this room is something that we must never, ever lose. Thank you.